So welcome everybody to a little seminar here, looking into a discussion on whether or not people can change. We'll be talking about things like ban appeals, restitution, punishment, and safety in Amtgard settings. Um, so this is going to be more of a moderated discussion period centered around that kind of topic. Looking into things like what people can do to show personal growth, personal change, how and should we consider allowing people that have shown these changes to come back, how to balance victim comfort and encouraging people to improve themselves, whether or not we should even bother trying to. Um, so, start off, I'm going to do like a bit of a little bit of a lecture, just some descriptions and um, definitions out. And then we'll get into a bit more moderated discussion. If you guys ever have any questions or have any comments you want to make, please feel free to toss the hand up into the Classroom 2 chat or just type out your question or comment there as well. That'll also work. Um, so, first off, who am I and what gives me the right to host this kind of seminar? Um, so, I'm Pythar Squire, Lad of the Ageless, Master Enchanter, Builder of the Forest, Son of the Nine Blades, the Defender. In other words, my name is Nathan Omerdine. I've been playing Amtgard since May 2014, starting in Felfrost. A fun little story about me is that about a month and a half after my first recorded orc sign-in, I hitchhiked to Team Tactics after doing a military fitness test. Because at the time I was at school and did have my vehicle with me. Um, my Amtgard career includes 2 terms of Kingdom Champion. The current one is included. 2 terms as Kingdom GMR. I'm also currently in my second term on the Kingdom BOD. I'm the current Kingdom Rules Rep. I'm also on the IKCOM, the Interkingdom Circle of Monarchs Award Evaluation Committee. One of the people that helped create the Orders of Battle. I've been part of multiple disciplinary investigations and have a fair amount of experience at this point. Outside of Amtgard, I'm a vehicle tech at the military, and I'm trained Sentinel, which is like a first line mental health support network kind of training. Uh, excuse me. Some past relevant experiences include being both a president of a youth leadership organization called the Order of DMLA, both at the local level as well as the provincial level, um, including acting as a jurisdictional officer at events in Ontario as well as in a couple of different states. Um, I've also been part of the risk management committee at my Acacia fraternity at Carleton University. Um, I've got a BA in applied linguistics and discourse studies, which to clarify is not that I speak multiple languages. It means that I am a lot more analytical on people's choice of words, what they say, what they don't say, so as to try to have a better understanding of what people are actually saying, whether they're consciously saying it or not. Um, so our discussion is going to really go into uh, uh, how people can change in regards to past offenders in an Amtgard setting. Now, to clarify, I don't mean sexual offender, because I know that's where a lot of people's minds go to when they hear the word offender. Um, we're going to use the second offender's dictionary, or dictionary definition, which we define as a person or thing that offends, does something wrong, or causes problems. The first definition is a person who commits an illegal act, but as is often quickly pointed out, we are not a court of law. Doesn't matter what committee we're on or what level of Amtgard we're on. We're not a court of law, so we do not have the grounds or capacity to pass the judgment that someone has broken the law or not, regardless how justified we may feel. So again, we're going to go back and stick with the one where it's just someone who a person or thing that offends, does something wrong, or causes problems. I also want to state right here at the onset that due to the very nature of this topic, that there are significant chance that we are going to be broaching topics including but not limited to violence, sexual misconduct, harassment, or bullying. Um, so consider that a content warning for it. Um, as we're going through this, I do intend to provide examples and suggestions on either side of this topic. Expect me to play devil's advocate relatively frequently. Remember that we are all here in good faith, and that even though this can be a very tense and difficult topic of discussion, it is also an important one that we as a community do need to consider and address in a rational and proactive way, as opposed to a reactively and possibly irrationally after an incident occurs. Um, so now that we've defined what an offender is, which will actually shorten a bit to take away the thing part, so it's just a person that offends, does something wrong, or causes problems. We're also going to go over and define some of the things that they can do wrong. Particularly in Amtgard, we're going to be talking about the Code of Conduct, which is in the fourth page of the Rules of Play, and that's broken up into 7 parts. Number one, speech that would cause a reasonable person for fear or to fear for their public. Jesus Christ, sorry. Speech that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their property or safety. Number two, physical violence outside of the normal bounds of combat conduct. Number three, sexual harassment or inappropriate sexual contact. Number four, theft or willful destruction of other people's property. Number five, repeated unwillingness to follow game rules. Number six, creating a hostile environment detrimental to the enjoyment of the group as a whole. This includes engaging in online or in person harassment. And number seven, violating the Amtgard youth policy, which can be found at the website or at the index at the end of the rules of play document. Um, because I was curious about it, I did go back to try and find the history of the COC. Because I just joined as V8 was coming out of playtesting, and from the best I can tell, the COC was only added in 2015 with the V8 rulebook. Prior to V8, there was no COC. Even at the beginning of V8, it just had the first 6 and did not specifically mention online in number 6. V7.7 didn't have the COC at all, and they did V7, V6, which means leaves me pretty confident that there wasn't one prior to V8. Um, in fairness, V7.7 did have the following line, uh, and I quote, "Common sense and fair play should be used to resolve any problems," which obviously should have covered all the bases. Um, and jokes aside, it's important to know that where the game's conduct expectations come from, or came from, in order to properly and fairly apply it to where it is, particularly in regards to older players, or I guess rather more veteran players. Um, Again, I joined Amtgard just as V8 came into effect, so I didn't have any experiences with V7.7 or prior. But I can say that even anecdotally, the difference is almost night and day in how Amtgard has changed pre V8 and post V8. I've heard many a story of crazy things happening events, some fun crazy and some absolutely just horrific kinds of crazy things. And I've been part of investigations about shit that's happened in those quote unquote before times. And it baffles me not just to why people like what people did and why, but also how some of it went so long without being properly addressed. But we're not here to talk about that. And we're not going to be talking about the investigation procedures or disciplinary action stuff like that because that's going to be in my second class later today. I bring this up because it helps shape the context of our uh, many of our offenders. Um, so, oh, it's important for us going into this to think about and consider what is ban worthy and what contributes to the severity of bans or other disciplinary actions. Um, the first point that I really think is important for us to get into is the discussion of intent versus impact. Um, So I'm sure that this is something that we have taught that has been brought up many times, and people are quite familiar with it. But I am just going to go over it with now. Is that basically intent is what you wanted to do, is your goal for an action. It reflects the impact that you want to have. Whereas impact is the reality of those actions. It might not be what you intended. Intent is how you think or feel. Impact is how your actions make others feel. Intent is who you are, and impact is what you did. The good quote to view this is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's kind of extreme for this, but it is a good example uh, because it's. This lost my train of thought there. Sorry. Um, and those last two things, what I said there was intent is who you are, and impact is what you did. The impact is usually where most outsiders view an offense, and that is their stop line of what they're considering there. They see someone do something wrong, and they go, "That person is bad because they did X." A lot of the time, they people don't tend to consider the intent, or like you know consider past the impact of someone's actions. Um, and it is important to do, especially if you are someone who is part of the investigative or disciplinary committee, whoever's handling it. But also, if you're just an outsider, when you see something happen or someone get um, someone receiving a disciplinary action, I would always encourage people to obviously be aware that the officers that are levying or that are administering the disciplinary actions are doing so with reasons, but don't make the mistake of feeling that that's where that person or that's who that person is. Separating the offense from the person is important. So, does anyone have any questions so far or any comments? So, I'm going to go through a bit of a scenario here, and it's going to seem kind of rambly, seem kind of out of it, but I promise I am going to keep it relevant. Um, if you have questions of where it's coming from or whatever, feel free to say something, or if you have any concerns, that's fine. But I'm going to just go through it, and I'm going to then bring up the other points of why it's relevant. So I'd like you to try and pretend that you are someone who's been playing since the 7.5, which is, I think, about 2005. Um, you go to field every week. You play in battle games. You've held office. You've gone to you know Great Eastern, Fear of the Northlands, Golden Vale every chance you had. You you know you gamed hard. You partied harder. You and your friends always had fun. Hit the ditch field, have a drink in one hand, or the other. When the Northern Empire became a thing and Battle of the Dens and team tactics happened, you did the same thing there. You went, had a ton of fun at every event, have a whole bunch of good, awesome stories. You and some friends go crawling through the brush, ambushing a bunch of people right outside hut base, storming in, grabbing the flag, getting back, becoming a hero for getting that 1 point that year. Stories about like being on a quest, rocking out as a bard, like, going in and just killing it so well that you convince an NPC to give you the treasure that they're trying to guard. Uh, think about like the awesome drunken fireside songs. All the bardics that you have about the team tactics, all the camping events. Think about the year that there was a fire was going, but bardic hasn't started yet because our like the main bard hadn't even showed up yet. So everyone thought it'd be fun to try and summon that bard by taking off their shirts, mostly, and of course whoever wanted to really. It's like all the crazy fun stories. And a couple of years obviously have gone by. Then nowadays goes on, and suddenly you get a message from the Kingdom Monarch and the Kingdom GMR and the Kingdom Prime Minister telling you that you're being suspended indefinitely while they investigate allegations of a breach of COC 6 and maybe COC 3. Now, that might seem crazy. It's like you haven't been toxic. You're certainly not, some rapists. You're not doing any kind of sexual misconduct. You didn't touch anyone against their consent, nothing like that. And so you probably don't have any idea what it's about. And you can't really ask for details because that can't get you anymore. They just say that for the protection of the victims, they've shared all they can. In that situation, what can you do? But if we look at it from an outside perspective, that drunken fighting, drinking one hand, sort of the other, maybe there was a couple times you didn't notice how hard you swung, or your aim got worse and you did some extra face shots. It's like you didn't obviously didn't go out of the way to hurt people. And it's like if anyone calls you out on it, then you do what anyone does when they're being called out for being unsafe, and you stepped out, you stopped fighting, or you just went off and like this with your friends in the corner, away from other people. It's like you respected when people told you to step off. The story about that you remember about going in and ambushing a bunch of people and getting the flag at Bot D, but in reality, maybe that was just a group of newbies in front of Hut Base, and then as you guys went and demolished them, rushed to get the flag. Everyone knows like those are super tight corridors. Like you need to get past. Sometimes you're stopping. Sometimes like you'll help people get out of the way a little bit, little small shoves just to get by. Um, but new players might not necessarily know that you're doing it just because it happens. They might find that, you're being more aggressive than you actually are just because you're trying to get past and you're focusing here. They see that those little shoves and take that to be a lot more than it is because all of a sudden maybe, you know, you could be a knight, you could be an officer, someone that they know is important around a lot. That fun story that you might have about, being a bard and convincing an NPC to give up the treasure they're guarding. It's like you might not remember it, but they remember that you were role playing, mocking them. You were making fun of them, and like you obviously felt that it was like in character. You're joking. This is part of the quest. You're trying to get the treasure, but maybe they start take it a little bit to heart. It's like obviously you didn't mean it, and it was just a kind of role play, but they gave it to you just to get rid of you. If you if no one says anything, you might not even have realized that was a thing. The fun story about summoning the bard to the campfire by taking people's shirts off was a joke. It was just fun games. Sure, there was like some teasing and peer pressure, but no one actually like forced anyone. But like the friendly encouragement to do so was always there. So maybe some people weren't comfortable doing so, but were less comfortable saying no. So obviously, you never would have pushed them if you knew they didn't want to do it. But without them voicing that they didn't want to necessarily do it, maybe they still did it. Now, for the most part, those are just made up stories. It can be pretty obvious what's right or wrong, what's toxic behavior, what might be sexual misconduct. If you're that person, though, it might not be. At least not without someone sitting it down and pointing it out to you. Because even then, you might get defensive about it. After all, if someone's showing you things you've done and calling it toxic, then they're calling you toxic, aren't they? Now, there's a time to give off this little scenario thing because I honestly really believe that it's very easy to see an offender and equate them to their offense. So, XYZ was banned for COC 6, that just means they're a toxic player. When in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. Something I've seen in my time in office and in discussions and just in generally speaking, a lot, and I mean a lot of the time in Amtgard, and then realistically in the real world, a lot of toxicity, aggression, arguments, and hostility come from nothing more than miscommunications and misunderstandings. Because people grow up and live with different ideas of what's okay and what's not okay, and I'm not just talking about like overall morals here. I'm talking about like literal day to day things. To give a personal example, my family is very unafraid to be confrontational. If someone has a problem, they're not afraid to call you out and say so. I'm in military. I did cadets in high school, and I've been a whole bunch of different organizations, extracurriculars, where things like chains of commands or like some kind of hierarchy existed. So I'm intimately familiar with people telling me to do something or what needs to be done. So, as an example, like someone needs the door shut, they'd be like, Nathan, shut the door now. Conversely, Kristen, Phelan, my wife, hates, absolutely hates that assertive, direct tone of voice and way of speaking. Um, when we were first staying together, we had a lot of issues, especially when I was in basic or like on base and then coming back to visit for a weekend because I had to very much learn to not use my work voice at home because at work it's a do this or it's a what the hell like it's like if there's an issue it's like okay well fix it solve it which is not you know that's not the tone of voice that you want to use for everybody. Additionally, her family isn't like that. They also are very very non-confrontational to the extent it drives me nuts sometimes. So like instead of whereas I'm used to being like, "Hey, shut the door now." For them, it'd be more like a, "Hey, do you mind shutting the door?" Um, so like, if someone were to ask me to shut the door, and I say, "Okay," but I'm in the middle of something and I don't do it right away, they might instead just shut the door themselves, or they might ask someone else to do it, and they might think me as being rude for not shutting the door after they ask me, or maybe, but they don't necessarily know why I didn't shut the door, but they might still think I'm rude. Because I could just be being rude and just kind of be fucking them off, or maybe I left it open for a breeze because someone just sprayed perfume and the smell's giving me a headache, or I'm about to bring stuff outside. Without having that open communication, mis- that miscommunication that can happen there causes or can be a source of tension and hostility. Because again, they might think me as being rude or incompetent or hostile for ignoring them, whereas I was just waiting to when I was ready to do it. Because the way it was worded didn't have a time frame in it. They're just saying, "Hey, do you mind shutting the door?" So when they go and shut it themselves, maybe right before I was about to, all of a sudden maybe now I start to feel slighted or insulted. Do they not think me capable of shutting the door? Now I might see them as rude. Stuff like that happens literally all the time. We see it when people bring up problems with officers, or make suggestions or offer to run things, or take over responsibilities. We far too often find personal attachment into things that go on. An important example is the impeachment of an officer. Yes, it's a shitty situation for the officer, but that doesn't mean it's a personal attack against them. If Kristen doesn't like how I'm doing with Kingdom Champion, because I promised XYZ and I only rated X, she can put me up for impeachment, and that's okay. It doesn't mean she hates me or thinks that I'm a shitty officer or even a like shitty champion. It just means that she doesn't want me as champion right now. And I know I'm really sorry to ramble on with these anecdotes. Well, only partially sorry, because I think they're important to give context to what I'm trying to get across. So to summarize a little better, is that like miscommunications, um, impeachments, differences, allegations of toxicity, stuff like this, are all relevant because of perspective. People's perspectives can differ greatly, and it needs to be taken into account for. So, in my earlier example of you as a veteran player, there's a number of situations there that can absolutely be seen as problematic from one lens, but from another lens can be seen completely okay, which is why I bring us back to the intent versus impact. So if we can go back to that one of the previous examples, the specifically the example about taking shirts off to summon the bard for the fire. Now I know this kind of can seem like a bit of a ridiculous example. This is actually the one aspect of that whole scenario that is legit, that actually happened. I remember I was there for it. And I was also one of the people that took off my shirt to help summon the bard. And at the time, like I was having a blast. I found it hilarious. And to my memory, so did everyone else that were taking part of it. Um, to my knowledge, no one took part that didn't want to, but it's obviously not hard to see how the intent versus impact could have been felt there. If I tried to get someone to take part that was reluctant to or didn't want to, my intent could have still been good. I was trying to have fun. Maybe they were a good friend, and we're just shy. So I was trying to help them come out of their shell, and that maybe they'd enjoyed themselves more if they joined in the shenanigans. The impact, though, could have been disastrous. Maybe they had self esteem issues, and it made them have a panic attack. Or maybe they had previous trauma that was giving them flashbacks of. Maybe they just weren't comfortable doing that around people they didn't know well and didn't want to do it. In any case, they could have just felt like I was pressuring them into taking off their shirt for some stupid reason and something that a lot less of me. So, in that theoretical situation, my intent might have honestly been good, but with the impact being negative, it's still a problematic scenario. I bring this up because I guess my hot take here is that sometimes intent is just as, if not more important than the impact. I hesitate more important, but it is just as important than the impact. Um, so, choose the example of Kristen bringing me up for impeachment. Say where she were to do that. The impact could be me getting absolutely blindsided and being upset and angry by, giving her the silent treatment or whatever, or getting upset and, lashing out at her. But maybe when she finally talks about it, I find out that her intent is that she knows, I've been struggling mentally, I've been having health issues, whatever, being sick, and she just thinks I've been having too much on my plate. But because she knows I wouldn't step down, she just tried to force me to step down to lessen my workload. In that situation, her intent might have been helpful and caring, and maybe after hearing and processing, I acknowledge that, but that doesn't mean the impact didn't matter either. Having a clear and open discussion can help clear the air, though. For example, in that situation, if I were to say, like, Kristen, I know you intended to help my mental health and stuff, but trying to impeach me just made me feel stressed and anxious. Where I acknowledge the intent of the action, but I can also showcase the impact. Now, if we were to apply it to the theoretical shirt example, um, you know, say that whole thing happened overnight, then the next morning, the monarch comes in with a GMR and sits myself and that friend down to talk about it, and they talk about how, um, you know, they felt that me trying to get them to join in with the shirts thing made them felt uncomfortable and anxious. So I would explain that, I'm sorry. I know they're shy. I was trying to get them to come out of their shell, have some fun, be silly at the fire. Maybe they said they wanted to do that, like on the drive up to Badi, um, and that I had no idea that I was making them feel that badly. So, you know, they could acknowledge it and then explain that that's not the right way to get them to participate. Um, I acknowledge that, no problem. But even then, the monarch, because obviously it's so problematic behavior, could acknowledge that my intent might have been nice, but pushing people to try and take off their clothes or whatever to participate in the funness isn't acceptable behavior. So instead of a straight CO3 3, which absolutely would have been fair game, theoretically speaking, instead considering it like an official warning. And like a situation like that, if we start with open discussion, that there's a problem, acknowledging what the problem was, the impact was, finding out what the intent was, and acknowledging that as well, can help solve and take into account both when deciding what the consequence of the action should be. So to recap here, An offender can commit an offense without realizing it. They can also commit an offense while trying to do something good and not realize it. So both the intent and the impact of an offense is important to take into account. Clear and open communication is crucial to preventing a lot of accidental and unnecessary hostility, anger, and other negative feelings that can lead to toxicity or aggression. Very clickish. How do you? So I'm going to read out comment question stuff because I know it's being recorded as well. Um, Whichever asks, Amtgard is very cliquish. How do you balance open communication if the offended party feels they can't sit down because the aggressor is part of the crowd and the balance of power is one sided? This is an excellent question and is absolutely accurate. Amtgard is extremely cliquish and it's frustrating, incredibly frustrating at times. Um, there's, how do I say this? It's difficult because in some ways, it takes a leap of faith on both ends. Um, Balance of power. How do I say this? There is a. I suppose it would depend on the type of balance of power. Um, because I think it's fair to say in most cases, uh, we're probably going to be talking about people in office, I would assume. Could also be as people on like the COK or people on COP, where whose opinions can influence personal goals. In situations where open communication, I think, is important, but you don't feel safe or comfortable sitting down with them and having that conversation because um, you feel there is that power imbalance. You can also use things such as mediators. I believe like I should correct myself. I was gonna suggest the ombudsman, but I because we have used them as mediators before. I am in hindsight trying to remember whether or not that's something that they said was your job or not. They still did it anyway, but and if you're not comfortable going to ombudsman about it, if there are um, other officers you're comfortable with, they can also usually help. The balance of power, which obviously says the balance of power does work both ways. People being punished because of the offended party can also be part of the in crowd, and people in power, through the eyes of a newcomer, officers both local and kingdom, BOD members, knights, and those who are close to those people. So the idea of the how to say in crowd, I guess, is problematic in and of itself because it naturally immediately implies an out crowd, which is Amgard feels more cliquish because people believe it's more cliquish than it actually is. Amgard is a very small, is a relatively speaking, a very small community. Most people know most people in it. Um, so just it's a naturally occurring thing where people that are friends will tend to hang out. And when you are newer or are not friends with specific people, it can be difficult to approach friend groups who have those people that you either don't know or are not do not have good relationships with. We as a whole need to do better at separating personal relationships with being able to be more, I hesitate to say professional because obviously this is not necessarily a professional environment, but at least more civil, I guess. Um, Obviously, easier said than done, because it can very much vary.
Perhaps unbiased is the word you're trying to find?
No, because well, there's other things like everyone is biased. People are always going to be biased, no matter how much you try to avoid it. You, it is literally impossible for you to get to not to be unbiased completely. Um, at best, you can acknowledge your bias. Uh, yeah, it's realizing your biases, acknowledging them, and being aware of them. But even that has its own risk of overcompensating in the opposite direction. But that's which is more of an issue looking at biases when you're in an office perspective. A lot of time that comes to terms with things like investigations or rewards. But when it's talked about the interpersonal relationships, so as Delilah had said, friend groups aren't necessarily cliques. But as for newcomers, as Delilah is saying now, it can be intimidating and come across as a set of exclusory cliques. Um, I guess Pandora, I appreciate that. That is a fantastic comment. So Pandora said that, in her opinion, friend groups are cliques when they can't separate their relationships from decisions, such as awards, bans, tolerating certain behaviors, or when they actively exclude others. That is an excellent distinction and definition for it. I am not going to say that it doesn't happen because I can immediately think of a couple of examples, um, when that's a thing. But I think cliques to that extent are far less common than people think. Because of that, um, when you are unfamiliar with people, it is a lot more intimidating, and seeing a friend group can come across as a clique. Uh, Delilah has a great comment there. If we can't hold our friends accountable, then we've passed into the problematic territory, which is another fantastic way to describe and look at this. Um, so to go back and kind of answer Rajavi's first question of how to balance open communication if a offending party feels they can't sit down because the aggressor is part of the in crowd, or I guess vice versa. Um, this is a part of the issue that Amtgard has with, particularly with how we, excuse me, conduct investigations of what we can and cannot share with the public. It's also part of the reason why, and what ends up being incredibly problematic, of the theory behind our corpora and our government is that we elect people that we trust so we can trust them to make the right decisions. It is healthy for us to question and like be aware of, decisions that the monarchy is making, but it is unhealthy for the populace to challenge and call into question the, um, honesty is not the right word here. Validity is, well, the word for validity works. The validity of decisions being made. Um, we have to do better with trusting our officers and that they are making good decisions. And again, a large part of this problem is because of how private we keep our investigations, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's important for us to, you know, protect the privacy of both the victims and the offenders, because yes, they do both deserve some privacy. Um, but it does not. That is not something that's conducive to the transparency that people seem to expect from their officers. Um, yep. Uh, Faye Wellen brings up the point that there's also local kingdom BOD, inter-kingdom circle of monarchs, and the Amtgard International Board of Directors. There's a lot of different levels that you can talk to, and there's like over 20 people that you can talk to. Um, as Delilah says, and of those groups, hopefully your park has someone who can also help you get in touch with those people and help you advocate for yourself if you don't feel comfortable doing so in the local situation you're in. For those curious, if there are any of those groups you want to talk to and are trying to figure out how, locals, obviously, your park officers, you can talk to them. Kingdom um, are the kingdom officers, so I'm the champion. Fei Lin is the monarch. Um, the Fubard is the KGMR. Um, oh god, Petra is the chancellor, and oh god, what's her character name? Uh, our regent. Oh, yeah, it's Delilah. Oh yeah, oh yeah, I see. Yeah, right. Yeah, Delilah's our regent. Yeah, okay, I'm not losing my mind. We're fine. Everything's fine. Um, Actually, does our Facebook group not have everyone's positions? Or it did at some point? Okay, yeah, well, anyway, there's lots of people you can go to. Um, just more experienced people will also at least know who to get to. Uh, does it? See, I know that the our about thing has the park officers, but it's fine. Whatever. Okay, goddamn, I got distracted again here. So yeah, if there's an imbalance of power, to do an open discussion, open communication, you can always use mediators, both at any of the different levels. Um, in the people that are inner kingdom and outside of the kingdom, um, are I don't think I've ever reached out to one for help that either hasn't been able to help himself or hasn't been willing to help himself or hasn't been able to refer me to someone who can help. Um, but a big part of it is just going to be having the courage to try and do so, uh, which is difficult. Like I know it's a lot easier for me to say than it is to actually do, but it is a step that needs to be done. Back to your example. Javier says, going back to your example, sure, communication is important, but if you were doing multiple things that are making multiple people uncomfortable, I do think the trio needs to take you aside and say, tone it down a bit. These actions are bothering people. If you choose to still do it and get banned, that is on you. If you make a conscious decision to do things you know make people uncomfortable, then you don't deserve their chance. So I am hesitant to say that I fully agree with that comment. There's a whole lot of factors there that are relevant. Making people uncomfortable is not something that is ban worthy. I'm gonna say that right now. Uh, with the with the asterisk of it depends how people are being made uncomfortable. Uh, Obviously, if it's in a context more of a like a COC3, people are being physically uncomfortable. That is a different discussion. That is a lot more relevant to being ban worthy. If people like invading personal space or being uh, too touchy feely, things like that. That is a lot more of a don't deserve their chance. If it's regards to you know how people talk, as long as it is in respectful ways, that is not something that's ban worthy. Um, it is not uncommon for people to be uncomfortable or offended by people who speak in different ways or different tones than they're used to, which kind of goes back to that perspective example I was talking about with how my family is more confrontational and more direct than Kristen and her family. Um, because if I spoke to Kristen the way I do my coworkers, for example, that would be a lot more. That would make her a lot more uncomfortable and upset. Obviously, than I do with my coworkers. Um, as Delilah was saying, uh, she thinks it's fair to say it depends. Something that makes one person uncomfortable might not make others uncomfortable. Sometimes Torvik uses a tone of voice that gets her feathers ruffled, but Delilah knows that's just how he is, and that she can call him out if he's saying anything totally off base, but she's not about to tell the Kingdom Monarch to deal with it. There is significant levels of interpersonal relationships and having to deal with people that you don't necessarily like, don't necessarily agree with, that comes with being in a social group with a lot of different types of people. I see. Um, Faye Wellen says it's true. She has a totally different vernacular when investigating or serious matters that can come off as cold. I am very much in the same way as those who have had the pleasure of having me message them during investigations have done. Um, so I do want to change the topic up a bit and want to talk a bit about the purpose and tools of our disciplinary system um, in Amtgard, and how it should be taken into account. Feel free to keep messaging what you're typing up now. I'm just going to continue in the meantime. So, obviously, everyone knows that for bans and suspensions, it requires the monarch plus one, so that's either the GMR or the prime minister, to ban someone from the group or and subgroups. So, a local monarch and a local GMR can ban someone from a park, whereas if a kingdom monarch and a kingdom GMR ban someone, then they are banned from that kingdom and all its parks. Um, the only other disciplinary action or individuals that can administer disciplinary actions in the rules of play are reeves, who have the power to remove players from games, um, either temporarily or, well, really only temporarily. But they can remove people from games to prevent them from participating in combat. Those are the only two disciplinary actions that are in the rulebook. Um, Delilah says there's a certain amount of ego playing into a lot of these incidents too, something that we all as humans have to challenge in ourselves and others. Give everyone grace, assume the best intentions, not everything is personal, etc. That doesn't mean our feelings are invalid or that actions slash words haven't hurt us. It means that we approach whatever comes next by looking at the whole context. That is a fantastic comment. This is something that I try to take into account myself of giving people the benefit of the doubt, but I also try to impress upon other people that often will rant or complain to me about things, and I'll often annoy them when I say like it's not about you. It's like this is happening, but it's not about you. They're not doing this to go after you. It's like they're just doing this because they think this is the right thing to do. Um, yeah, so uh, fantastic comment, Delilah. But that's fair, yeah. Or they don't think it's the wrong thing to do. That's valid. Um, which is often also again that same issue with perspective. So again, yeah, the rules of play only allow the provisions for banning suspensions by the monarch +1 or Rees from restricting people from combat. There's obviously a lot of other disciplinary actions that can be done. For example, the board of directors can pull waivers, which is technically not an administrative action, but that's the board of directors saying that someone is a liability to our organization as an NPO, and no one can participate in the Amtgard without a waiver signed with us. So effectively, a BOD pulling a waiver is them banning them. Um, for bans and suspensions, there's also two different types. There's set timeframes and there's indefinite. And to clarify, because it's often misunderstood, an indefinite does not mean a permanent ban. An indefinite means an undetermined amount of time for the ban. Often they're likened to the same when it's not accurate. An indefinite amount of time can have a cap to it. It can be put to a cap. Um, and just until that cap is put there, that endpoint is put there, it is indefinite until that point. Whereas obviously a set time frame is going to have that suspension for that period of time, and then it will end, and they are welcome back in the game. There's also a number of different restrictions that can be applied. One of the, I shouldn't say common ones, but one of the other known ones are restrictions from office or from leadership. So bans that prevent a person from taking office for X amount of time. Bans from or restrictions from participating in combat. Restrictions from overnight events. From using intoxicants, so like weed or alcohol at events. Um, restrictions from running activities, etc. There's a whole bunch of different things. Yeah, handling club funds. There's a lot of different restrictions we can put in place that aren't always thought of. People a lot of times will just go to that ban suspension. That's the only tool we have, which is not accurate. Um, the rules of play also have a couple of provisions where any kingdom level ban levied on a player from their home kingdom under the COCs 1 to 5 and number 7, aka everything except COC 6, automatically propagates to all the other kingdoms. Um, and no one convicted of a felony level sexual offense in the United States or is listed as a sexual offender registry can participate in Amtgard function at any time. Um, again, I think Lisa did point it out earlier, uh, but even though it says United States, it's applies everywhere. I don't know why they haven't changed that. Um, so looking at this, I think we need to discuss the purpose of our disciplinary actions. Are we just doing it to punish people for their for causing offenses? Are we there to solely to ensure the safety of our players? Is it a combination of the two? It's something that we do need to discuss because it absolutely has a large factor in how we deal with people that would like to appeal or come back to the game after being banned. Um, some of the factors that we should be also be aware of in that discussion is things like whether the offense was malicious or non-malicious, which kind of goes back to that intent versus impact discussion we had earlier. Someone who's doing something that is absolutely wrong, um, such as a COC3, like a sexual assault or something like that is not really that's not a question of whether or not that was an okay thing. The correction, I'm going to backtrack on that because those aren't necessarily as clear cut at all times. Um, Phelan has a great point, whereas a reminder that Amtgard is a duty to report organization, uh, specifically speaking for our CRC 7 and for our youth policy, where any youth that is in danger of violence or has received violence has to be reported to the police. They'll have, oh yeah, that's a good way to word it, is punitive versus restorative consequences when I was talking about the punishment versus safety. Actually, well, even that's slightly different. That's more like the punishment versus rehabilitation discussion, as opposed to the punishment versus you know player safety, uh, which I guess now is that all three of those things are possible factors. Another factor to be aware of when talking about offenders is like the COC number, because what people are banned for is absolutely a relevant factor on whether or not they should be allowed back, um, as well as the power dynamics and when they committed their offense, the severity of the offense itself, um, how long it's been since that offense, or the how long of time that offense occurred, like if it was recurring over just versus like a single incident, um, if they've got had warnings first or not, if they had past offenses or not, whether they're a risk or not to come back, and if they are a risk, how much of a risk? Because yes, technically speaking, everyone is always a risk, and whether or not there's risk of them repeating their actions. They're all things that need to be taken into account when we're looking at possibly bringing someone back to the game that has been banned. Drink real quick. So, what are the methods and the factors of overturning bans? Um, Strictly speaking, according to the rules of play, the only way to overturn a ban is if the monarch plus one, so the GMR or prime minister, at the level or above the level of the where the ban was levied, overturns it. They can do so. Um, Aside from that, there is no overturning a ban per the rules of play, with the exception that a kingdom monarch plus one can exempt their kingdom from a propagated ban, except for one under COC 3. But in doing so, that's them stating that they believe the following is true: that the banned player poses no threat to the safety of players in the kingdom or subgroups, that the presence of the banned player won't create a hostile or unwelcoming environment for other players attending functions of the kingdom or subgroups related to the nature of the ban, and three, that there is a compelling reason to have the banned player participate in and is beneficial to the functioning of the kingdom and subgroups. Basically, a kingdom plus one or a kingdom monarch plus one can exempt their kingdom because if they don't think that the banned player is a threat, that they don't think it's going to cause issues in the environment there, and that it's beneficial to have that player participate. Pandora points out that, or it just says that she's always been for restorative whenever possible. A blanket investigation / ban process alone can destroy a person's reputation, willingness, and or opportunity to make reparations, whether or not their offense is legitimized at the end of the day. Of course, I'm not talking about serious actions that should not be tolerated, and unfortunately, our system is currently only punitive. I agree 100%. I actually saw. Oh, actually, I might have the save still. Uh, I'm gonna look this as I'm talking here, but I saw a while back in one of the kingdoms. I want to say it was the desert. No, desert winds. Sorry, I saved a screenshot. So maybe not. Oh, yeah, it's How the Gore. Here it is. Where they actually ended up, they had a band player uh, for a period of 1 year, but the duration was able to be reduced to 6 month ban if they suspended player provided proof of attending and passing a professional conflict resolution class. Um, the this idea of suggesting and or requiring some kind of personal work if someone wants to try and rejoin us is something that I'm personally am a large fan of. Uh, Dahlia says a solely punitive system can only perpetuate more harm. I agree completely. Um, where is it? And something that I hear often when I'm talking about this is that it's the whole idea that, oh, we don't have responsibility for offenders to do X, Y, Z. We don't have to allow them back. We don't have to help them change. We don't have to, uh, you know, suggest things for them to do better to come back. Blah blah blah. And I find that like throw away and forget it mentality is just super problematic, and like ultimately it's a detriment to the game. Um, Obviously, safety is going to be our first priority in all situations. If safety is in question, a banned individual should never be allowed back. Period. But if safety is not in question, like if it's like no risk, I can't say no risk. There's literally always a risk. Everyone is always a risk, whether they have caused an offense or not. But if safety is not really in question, and especially if someone has shown progress and efforts towards change, shouldn't they be given a chance? It's like personally, I think so. Um, because like when people get heated during battle games and have to step out of play, we allow them to come back later. Sometimes we need to tell them, like the Reeves need to tell them to step off and take a walk. Excuse me. And in those situations, obviously they're becoming problem players on the field. That's why we're telling them to take a walk. But when they acknowledge it and take a break and come back later when they're not being problematic, like recognizing someone like one's flaws and working to better oneself is an admirable thing. It should be lauded when it's done properly. And people aren't one-dimensional beings. They are not their offense. They can be and do so much more if we let them. And practically speaking, giving them opportunities to return doesn't have to be an all or nothing either. It can be done in steps if it's felt that it's needed. So, for example, restricting them only to field days and not to events, or not allowing them in company battles or games above X amount of people, restricting them from office, essentially requiring them to be chaperoned at an event by sticking them with a buddy. Like, there's a lot of different things we can do to allow people or to help people work their way back in while still being safe if that is a concern. Um, so Delilah says if they choose not to pursue those options to earn back trust, then that is on them. Of course, that's accurate. Rajavi says the question then becomes, does that person's second chance outweigh the trauma others may still be going through? Now, this is a very good question. Um, I have it higher here. Where is it here? Of the question I would ask uh, is there any situation where we allow banned people to return to Amtgard? So the two options in that question is yes or no. And obviously, we have had people who have been banned return to Amtgard. Uh, in which case, because we have and do allow people to ban people to return to Amtgard, is that we have to look at what were the requirements for that to happen. Obviously, player safety is important. Victim safety is important. Those are obviously the top two priorities. But then it's a question of victim comfort. What at what level is the victim comfort a breach of, reinforcing trauma as opposed to a, I don't, I'm struggling to find the words to say this because obviously, I should say obviously, I have not been experienced severe enough trauma that I feel that I can't justly, you know, make a call or gauge of what is an appropriate amount of exposure or trauma without it being unreasonable to how to say this of how to say how much exposure would be reasonable versus unreasonable in regards to trauma. Because obviously I haven't had to deal with that kind of trauma in my life yet, fortunately. And yeah, law systems, as I was saying, is that there is a lot more research that needs to be done because law systems at large are currently dealing with the same struggle in question. And anything serious like that is, as Pandora was saying, is beyond the scope of our regular officers and game designers. As Fairwell says, the question of, yes, who decides the avenues? Because the only issue that she had with the TD post was the book recommendations, which is valid. Because actually, I don't think that one had a specific. Yeah, it was a proof of attending and passing a professional conflict resolution class. So it's not a specific book, but it's proof that they participated in one. But even that, yeah, can be cost prohibitive to some people. Skathic says that so giving a chance to work on or establish community trust, which is exactly it. And it's going to be hard and difficult because in reality, someone that is a victim of an offender may realistically never um, trust or feel comfortable around their offender. Sounds worse when it's a visual like this. Uh, Around a band player, whereas that band player might not be a threat to them. Like they've perhaps have realized what they did was wrong, have tried to make amends, done what they can, and have accepted that there's nothing more that they can do. And at what point is it unreasonable for us to continue to refuse to allow that player to play for the comfort of one person? Um, Pandora says the trauma will exist even if that person never shows up again. Part of restorative justice is healing those harms as much as possible, which is valid. But I saw a post a little while ago, which is important that it should never be forced. But no, actually, that was forgiveness. Forgiveness is never forced and should never be required for healing, which is completely valid. Um, but uh, I think it. I personally believe that completely. There's a level of. I'm not sure where they at. I'm not gonna try it again. Some comments I need to catch up on. Llewellyn said that must have been a different post. Recommended reading several self-help books. Pandora says it's a nice idea for sure, and it's used by many indigenous communities and in some countries, but we don't have the training for it. I would like to see it implemented on a smaller scale, but I wouldn't dare making recommendations for anything beyond that. Basically, for example, instead of jumping right to suspending someone because someone else didn't like how they were spoken to, we should try to mediate first. Delilah responds to that by saying, absolutely, do we have the knowledge or obligation to vet those programs to decide what we will accept as legitimate proof? Llewellyn agrees with Pandora. Delilah also agrees, and if not mediate or at least intervene. Pandora's response to the vetting thing is definitely not, which is yeah valid. We really don't have the training to vet programs specifically, um, which really is part of the issue. And Billon says that she agrees 100% with mediation, and that bans as a first avenue for COC6 is in itself toxic, in her opinion. Um, I agree to an extent. To an extent, yeah. Everyone should have at least one warning first, depending on, obviously what they're doing. And the problem is we has to say, well, it is a problem, even though it is still done obviously with best intentions, of us trying to protect victim anonymity and privacy because we are often unable to give specific information on people's behavior, aka like what someone has actually done wrong, and we can only be general, then we are unable to identify to them the problematic behavior that needs to be fixed. And again, because of differences in perspective, it is unreasonable to say that it should be obvious what behavior is problematic and should be fixed and what is, you know, not obviously problematic behavior needs to be fixed. Because like I've seen people get warnings for COC6 or well get warnings for 6/3 for hugging too much because they never got any kind of uh they weren't directly told by people that they didn't want those hugs and stuff. um and especially in Amtgard, people are very huggy. That happens a lot, so they had assumed that it was okay because everyone else had been doing it. But people being uncomfortable but didn't say anything, they didn't catch those social cues, and so then got that warning. um Everyone says it used to be verbal, written, then suspension. So as warnings, yeah. And then obviously, if your CC6 is a pattern and not apologetic, it's different. And then yeah, that's your intent, yeah. And this is where the conversation about like intent versus impact comes into play, um, and is also relevant. I was a fan of the verbal, written, and suspension process for VCC 6 specifically. Um, it's there is a lot here to go into and to talk to, and it very much, I believe, comes largely to the conversation of balancing victim comfort, uh, and not re-traumatizing with possibly allowing someone who has improved himself to come back. And this is something that as a community we do need to make it, consider and work on making a decision for. Particularly if we were trying to reduce the amount of just straight, trust we have uh, in the officers, because even though we do theoretically have the all thing method of overturning bans, that is such a problematic thing because the populace does not have the information that the officers did when they made the ban. Yes, we do need a better, clear policy of petition removal. But it is the fact that because the populace does not have the information that the officers did when instituting the ban, they cannot give them a fully informed decision on removing someone's ban. Like personally, I started to lean towards that. I don't think that it should be officers doing disciplinary actions. I think it should be a specific like disciplinary committee. Um, but that's a whole nother thing. What time is it? What are we? 2:15 for 50 minutes. Okay. Okay. So sorry, my throat's killing me. All right. So we have a little bit less than 15 minutes now. So does anyone have any more comments or questions that they would like to bring up for us?
Uh, I don't have a keyboard, but can I ask a question vocally?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I wondered if so there are bans that are indefinite. Does the incoming or new government members coming into power have access to that information that the populace wouldn't, that you were just talking about?
The officers will have access to the list of band players to get the notes of uh, individual investigations and how they're kept track in the monarchy drive can vary um, depending on the, I guess I would say the topic of the investigation itself will depend on how much was kept. I know most of the investigations I've done, um, all the details remained with the investigative team. However, in the monarchy drive notes, we obviously labeled who was part of that team so that if future things came up and questions needed to be asked, they knew how to reach out to. And then, like personally, I have my own maintain my own notes on past investigations because they've unfortunately come up several times. However, uh, New Monarchy will obviously, yeah, will have access to the list of who's banned and their timelines, and I believe the COC numbers. Yeah, I will. Yeah,
As
that
a
would be.
follow,
Yeah, go
would
ahead.
it as a follow would it be prudent for the monarchy to pursue going back and investigating again, whether to unban or to further ban?
Uh, well, there's no further ban than indefinite. Um, I
Let's say one, given as an example, one had a limit and then was
okay,
then
yeah. So
reversed.
they it is always the purview of the monarch that they can choose to do that whether they want to or not. Um, whether it's prudent or not to do so is obviously going to be more of a matter of opinion. Uh, there's because it can depend on what the ban itself was done for. It can depend on how difficult it is to reopen an investigation. Not just like the um, how to say uh, literal difficulty of finding the information and all that again, but also when you're going into things that have a lot more sensitive topics, such as things that are possibly sexual assault or sexual misconduct, violence, things like that, and you have to reach out, and you have to possibly reach out to the victims again, because in most cases, when we speak to victims or witnesses, the expectation and uh, is made that the information they share is only going to be given to those people participating in the investigation. So whenever we add more people to the investigation or giving them more people access to the investigation, we, at least in my experience, have had to go back and ask those people for permission to do so. And a lot of people are not, obviously, not fans of having the same issue brought back up multiple times, especially if they are the victim in the situation. However, there is like I can personally say that there's more than one investigation that I would like to see looked back into. Um, but that's something I've been on before, and I've been waiting for those people to be willing to look into it anyway. Um, Skathik says, "Thank you for bringing up this difficult topic and offering a safe space to give insight and discuss, while also giving officer perspective that isn't evident on officer posts. I appreciate that. Um, at a oh god, was it 4:30? I think is my going to be my next class, which is going to be actually looking into investigative procedures. But I appreciate the comment. Phelan says that DoD keeps everything too as well, as far as she knows. Which obviously says BOD only keeps information they have access to. Phelan says it has happened, or you informed them beforehand. Yeah, or you informed them beforehand. So, yes, that's the lanky. Oh, Jesus, excuse me. Whereas, if we know that there's going to be a change in the investigation committee, especially like if a um, coronation's coming up, something like that, we'll often be like, hey, this reign is ending. This is going to be changing. We're just letting you know that more people may be given access to your statement. It mostly depends on whether or not the person had wanted to stay anonymous for the purpose of protection against retribution or not. Pandora's asks that I mentioned disciplinary committee and what's my vision for that. So ideally, I would like us to have a pool of people that have some kind of actual training into investigations, conflict resolution, and like victim privacy and how and those kinds of trainings. Um, because we have our effective disciplinary committee of our monarchy trio change every 6 months, our investigations that occur can often be drastically different and inconsistent in how they're done, which is, in my opinion, super problematic. And I'll get into that more in my next class as well. But yeah, the disciplinary committee is not, in my opinion, should not just be like just officers. It should be a bit of a um, what's it called, a bit more of a mix. Um, Avalon says it's also important to remember that there was a lawsuit filed in the U.S. for slander due to information within an investigation being made public, which is why there are disciplinary committee. Why there Yeah, which is why there was a disciplinary committee which was initially created, because it allows a non-biased group to have access to all the details without details being distributed to the public. Yeah. Um, Faye Wellen says, unfortunately, that the disciplinary committee is not possible due to whistleblower requiring a monarch and one other officer. I will go into this into the next class as well, because that's everyone is often thought to be the case, but that's not technically accurate. Because we cannot contradict the rules of play, but we can supplement it. AKA, we can not say that the rules. We can never tell the monarch and one of those two officers that they cannot ban a player, but that does not mean that we cannot have other methods of banning players. With that said, that is something that I've reached out to try and get clarity on. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who can possibly have input on that, and it's not clear who actually has the call on it. But yeah, there's a whole lot. Um, for example, it's like it can if we put in our corpora that by a section where it says by taking the position of monarch, you hereby acknowledge and give your what's it called permission and power for the corpora and all its actions to be given under your name, um, for example, then it can't. It would effectively mean that the oh, gee, I'm losing my mind. If we put a clause in the corpora saying that in order to be the kingdom monarch, you have to acknowledge and allow for the other provisions within the corpora to pass with the authority of the kingdom monarch. Uh, Otherwise, you forfeit being kingdom monarch. And effectively, that would give our corpora all the power it needs to do whatever it needs as the kingdom monarch and kingdom officers, whatever, um, in their name. Like, there are ways to go about it, even if you wanted to make sure that the rules of play were followed by letter. Um, Fedora says so the committee could advise a monarchy, which is, yeah, sure, they can always have a committee to advise the monarchy. Fevellon says if the trio was on the committee, then it's fine, but they can't outweigh or force an action. And again, I dispute that. They cannot contradict. No, correction. If our corpora were allowed the committee to do disciplinary actions, those disciplinary actions would be valid. However, the monarch plus one could always countermand them and go against it, and there would just be an endless circle of I'm banning and you're unbanning, and vice versa. It would just be messy. Rajavia says the whole point of putting the KGM on the BOD was for investigation purposes, and the BOD members serve 2-year terms. Fayeron says the BOD doesn't require actual conflict resolution training, though. Rajavia says maybe they should, and they could use a little conflict resolution, which I agree. The BOD would be a good group to have as a disciplinary committee, or at least have part of it because their terms are long enough for it to actually be effective. Whereas the short 6-month terms really are not long enough for it to be cost effective for us to like provide training, stuff like that. But so it is 2:28 now, so we're yes, Fablin. It's good that you already have the training. It is, yes. We're just coming up on 2:30, so this class is about to end. Thank you everyone for coming, listening, taking part in discussion.